Hello, my name is Ted Holden, and I would like to say a few words about one of the sexier topics in paleontology, which is the question of Neanderthals and what, if any, sort of relationship there might be between Neanderthals and modern humans. Neanderthal remains began turning up in the late 1820s in Europe, and specimens found in the Neander Valley in 1856 were first assigned a separate category. The remains were of immediate interest to Darwin, Lyell, Huxley, and other early proponents of the theory of evolution. 19th century authors described the Neanderthal in unflattering terms. Ignatius Donnelly described the first Neanderthal skull which turned up as belonging to a barbarian brute of the rudest possible sort, an undeveloped, brutal, savage man only a little above the gorilla in capacity. A reader assumes that Donnelly was not going to allow his daughter to marry such a person. Likewise, early representations of the Neanderthal, particularly those of Pierre Marcellin Boule, were not flattering. Nonetheless, the image of the Neanderthal that the public sees has undergone a substantial change within the past several decades, and all but one or two of the videos, which you will find on YouTube, show the Neanderthal as being different but not frightening. In other words, a creature substantially more like us than different from us. The Neanderthal thus, in recent times, has become a kind of a poster child for what one might call a kind of a multicultural approach to evolutionism. Nonetheless, there are still a number of things distinctly wrong with this picture. One such problem is that if you try to draw such a human-like Neanderthal with the eyes and nose as large as the bones indicate they would have to be, what you end up with is outlandish. Rob Gargett, the creator of the above reconstruction, notes that if you place the skulls of a human, a Neanderthal, and an African lion together, the two which have anything in common are the Neanderthal and the lion. In other words, much of the Neanderthal's physiology, and presumably the behavior which one would associate with it, resemble that of the big cats more than that of humans. Note that the eye sockets and nasal passages of the lion and the Neanderthal are much larger than those of the human. Aside from a much heavier bone structure than ours, Neanderthals had the conical rib cages seen in primates, which allow room for the huge upper body musculature of the great apes. Our own cylindrical rib cages would get in the way of that musculature. Despite any misgivings which they may have had, 19th century scholars viewed the Neanderthal as a primitive man rather than as an advanced ape, presumably because the skulls indicated a brain which was actually larger than ours. Recent studies, however, indicate that the Neanderthal brain was dominated by the areas of the brain associated with vision and motion, for reasons which are made clear in Cosmos in Collision. It is seen that the huge Neanderthal eyes and the similarly large eyes of dinosaurs were designed to deal with a very dark kind of a world, and that the Neanderthal brain was largely the neurological equivalent of the circuitry for a military night vision scope. Studies beginning in the late 1990s have indicated that the Neanderthal DNA was almost exactly halfway between human DNA and that of a chimpanzee. That totally eliminated the Neanderthal as a plausible evolutionary ancestor for modern man. The genetic gap is simply too wide. Scientists who ought to know better have therefore begun speaking of humans and Neanderthals as cousins, claiming that we had a common ancestor, usually given as Homo heidelbergensis, some 500,000 years ago. The obvious problem is that too genetically remote to be ancestral to is a transitive relationship. Heidelbergensis can be seen from morphology to be much further removed from us than the Neanderthal. The claim is similar to claiming that foxes could not be descended from wolves due to the genetic gap, and that, therefore, foxes must be descended directly from fish. This is merely the most obvious logical breakdown involved in recent claims regarding human evolution. There are several others as bad or worse. Enter at this point one Danny Vendramini, a New Zealand scholar with a multidisciplinary background that includes filmmaking and evolutionary biology. Vendramini has produced a theory featuring a radical new reconstruction of Neanderthals, which begins with something that somebody should have noticed in the 1800s. That is, aside from the substantially larger brain area, a Neanderthal skull is a near perfect fit for an ape's profile, while it is a very bad fit for one of ours. Vendramini commissioned a forensic artist to create a new Neanderthal reconstruction based on what skulls and bones actually indicate, as well as a realistic assessment of the Ice Age conditions in which Neanderthals lived, the kinds of tools and weapons they used, and the kinds of hunting they engaged in. He did not instruct the artist to create the most frightening monster ever yet seen. Apparently, he did not have to. Cro-Magnon needles are not uncommon, while nobody has ever yet found the first Neanderthal needle. A creature with a 6-inch long Ice Age fur coat plainly does not require clothing or needles. Also, if the comparative human in that last image was around 5'8", then a male Neanderthal could easily be 5'8" and weigh 300 pounds or more without any fat on him. Troy McLaughlin and I view Vendramini's reconstructions to be substantially accurate. The two very minor issues we have are the dark gray fur, which we believe should be reddish, and the slit eye pupils, which Vendramini assumes protected the huge eyes in daylight. We assume that Neanderthals never saw anything which we would call daylight. There are other parts of Vendramini's thesis which Troy and I have less use for. Nonetheless, if you have followed me this far, then you will have begun to realize that almost all of the material dealing with Neanderthals and other hominids, which you will find on YouTube, are deeply flawed, and that terms like Neanderthal man and Neanderthal humans are basically oxymorons. This is what a skull from the so-called common ancestor, that is, Homo heidelbergensis, looks like. I assume that would look about as scary to a Neanderthal as a Neanderthal looks to us. This is a sample of Cro-Magnon artwork. In other words, Cro-Magnons are basically just humans like us. We read that some, not all, modern humans contain Neanderthal genes, and that this implies some level of interbreeding between our own ancestors and Neanderthals. Some of these claims come from the Max Planck Institute. Nonetheless, such claims have to be able to pass simple sniff tests for logic to be believable, and these claims don't. The claim is that humans of European and Asian descent have 1 to 4% Neanderthal genes, and that Africans don't. But there is terribly little genetic diversity amongst modern humans. It is said that there is less genetic diversity in the entire human race than there is in a typical group of 50 African monkeys of the same species. This is attributed to a very recent population bottleneck that the human race went through, and that establishment scientists place around 45,000 years ago. At that time, they assumed there may have been as few as 50 modern humans alive on the Earth. Any crossbreeding with Neanderthals would have to have been either before or after this bottleneck. If it occurred prior to the bottleneck, Africans would not have been left out. If after the bottleneck and not involving Africans as per the claim, then the genetic gap between Africans and everybody else would be gigantic rather than minuscule as it actually is. Then, of course, there's the problem of believing that a Neanderthal male could or would rape a woman and, rather than cooking and eating her afterwards, somehow or other keep her alive long enough to bear a cross-species child, raise that child to reproductive age, and have him or her breed back into human populations without anybody catching on. Nonetheless, in the real world, Neanderthal females would kill that woman the first time her new owner left her alone for 5 minutes. The woman would not fare any better than the subjects of Soviet attempts to breed humans and apes into super workers in the 1930s, Other humans would notice that the child was different, the fur coat and whatnot, and humans would kill that child and everybody else like him as part of the same program that killed out the Neanderthal and every other hominid. They would not require degrees in anthropology or DNA testing to determine who to kill for that sort of reason. It would be exceedingly obvious. The 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA, which researchers at Max Planck claim to see in some modern humans, should not be interpreted as proof of past interbreeding. It should be viewed as evidence of an original designer using a few of the same low-level genetic parts for dissimilar projects. Likewise, you would almost certainly find a few of the same low-level C language functions in both rocket telemetry and banking software. That does not mean that NASA's software is hacked from that of J.P. Morgan. If you haven't already, you should watch Danny Bendermini's video, which is titled Neanderthal, Profile of a Super Predator on YouTube. You should also visit Danny's website, which is called www.themandus.org, and Troy McLaughlin and my website, which is www.cosmosincollision.com. Cosmos in Collision explains the huge Neanderthal and dinosaur eyes and the kind of reality for which they were adapted. Thank you.